So I'm curious to know what of the questions that I gave to you or sent to you that you felt maybe excited to talk about,
Right.
or that you thought nobody's ever asked me that. I want to talk about that.
Right.
Was there anything that maybe got triggered by, or even just thinking about talking to somebody about writing? What do you want to talk about?
Right. I think. Well, the funny thing is the one that I didn't want to answer. I can talk about that because that was honestly, I read them all. I thought, these are such good questions, and then I was like, oh, I don't want to answer that one.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
That was the one about what 2 books, if there was a fire, would you grab?
Yeah.
It's so funny because those are always like the desert island question, and I guess I was thinking, why do I not want to answer that? And I guess because it feels like it'll just like pin you down to what are the 2 great books? Like, are you going to say, like, when I think about it as desert island, would I grab, Shakespeare? Like, what could I read for a really long time and still not come to the end of like, okay, complete works of Shakespeare or something? But the 2 books I grabbed is just like, I thought, wow, that is such a hard question because I wouldn't want to be like pinned down. And I think that's the same thing. Wasn't there something there that was a little bit like, what about your own work jumps out at you, or do you know what I mean? And or what are you most pleased about, or something that you feel good about in your own writing, or something like that. And I was thinking, well, it's kind of like it's always what you wrote most recently. You know what I mean? And so, like, I definitely wouldn't grab one of my books, not because I don't like my books, but because, what would I grab? If I thought of a book at all, which I probably wouldn't in fire, I'd grab my laptop. I'd grab my laptop and whatever, The Living Creatures. But I was thinking about, it's always what you were working on most recently that kind of, for me anyway, that grabs me. Like, I guess I could look through books and go, oh, I think that part worked pretty well, But I always feel kind of far away from what I finished. I mean, not like within seconds, but you know what I mean? It's the stuff that's leaping out to my mind about what's working or what isn't working is usually what I'm working on now and what I wrote. Like, even my most recent book, I feel like, oh God, I feel like I'm writing so differently, And it was 5 years ago. That's not like a really short amount of time, but it's interesting that I feel like I'm a different writer. I don't know if anyone else would feel that way. Reading my books, they might go, no, but that's how I feel,
Yeah, it's interesting because I've been reading, or I just finished reading the reissue of Eileen Miles's Chelsea Girls.
Oh.
And that's that brings up an interesting idea of like reissuing a book that came out 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And having it, of course, be a new book for a lot of people in a completely different marketplace. And that's like a different question than sort of the desert island question, which I think I'm interested in that question because it's like, why do we ask ourselves these questions? These sort of like, if there is death, because we know there's death, or if there is like disaster, impending doom, or the unknown, really, then, it's sort of a question, I guess, of comfort, of either intellectual comfort or of physical comfort, like, to have the thing or to have the idea of the thing for a long time. I guess that's why I'm interested in that question, even though I know, like, I think on the surface it's kind of silly.
Right. Well, I think your books are your friends, and actually I was thinking about this a lot because something I haven't written, but I was thinking about working on, was because I grew up with a lot of writers, and then a lot of my parents' generation are getting older, and some of them have died, recently. And one of the things that's really interesting is the shelf of books, both the shelf of books that they wrote themselves, that James Baldwin thing about like, write a shelf of books, baby, a whole shelf of books, And I remember thinking about that James Baldwin quote and then thinking, well, it's not only that these people have written a shelf of books, but it's also what's on the shelf when they're on their way out. What books do they want within reach? And it's not their own books, it's like the books that are their greatest friends. Do you know? And I think that's kind of maybe what you were getting at too. Like, which are your, who do you want within reach? And that's really interesting, like who would be on your shelf, you know? And I've heard about some writer friends who, when they were dying, like, you know, would move they'd want certain books closer and then certain books further away. And then I had another friend of my dad's who was an editor, actually, but, you know, has spent his whole life, you know, editing very, you know, wonderful books. And when I went to visit him when he was dying, in his home, though, he wasn't like in the hospital yet, he invited me to pick some books from his shelves. Like, that's what he was doing with people who were coming by. And they weren't books he'd edited. They were like, these are the books I've collected, you know, over all these years. And that was really meaningful. I thought, what a great thing to do. You know, because now I look at this book and I think of Harvey, but I also think, wow, this came from his library. You know?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's also that trope of there sort of our lifeline. Books can be the lifeline through history to other people, to other lives, and that's surely a large part of, I think, why many people read and why many people write, that you become part of that lifeline for other people, or you get to connect with other people who you would never get a chance to meet, or you would never get a chance to understand what their life was like 100 years ago or 50 years ago.
Yeah.
And that's, you know, I think that's something, it probably gets tossed around a lot in academic settings, right? In trying to understand the context of things that you're reading. You know, the idea of the lifeline, or the idea of why any of this is meaningful, but it's a curious question. So are there any people that come to mind that you feel that lifeline to, or that you want to try to connect to, or that have been at certain points in your life like really
important, like lifeline books, kind of? There definitely have been, definitely. I think actually books in a weird way are kind of like always a lifeline. Do you know what I mean? Even if you're not in a situation where you need a lifeline per se, but it's like, you know, they're always like, I was definitely someone, probably a lot of us are like this, we're like, you just always had a book with you from when you were a kid, you know, and you know, it's like, oh shit, I don't have a book. Like if you go out, you know, and you're gonna get on the subway or something, and even now, you know, if it's on your device or whatever, so I think there's that feeling of security, and maybe that's like, you know, I've got my, you know, if I get in some weird situation, at least I have my book, you know, at least I have something to read. And I do read books a lot more than magazine. Like I read magazines in the newspaper, but for me that would be bringing my book with me, not, oh well, do I have the magazine or, you know, paper, you know, whether it's digital or print, you know. And I guess I'm trying to think who would have been. I mean, when I was a teenager, I read a lot of Colette, the French writer Colette, and she was very influential on me. I think this was before I even thought I would ever be a writer. I was kind of always writing, but I never took it very seriously. And but I gobbled her up. I read everything by Colette, and then I think that, you know, when I look back now, and then I even wrote a play about Colette where I got to play Colette, and I was kind of imagining myself into her music hall part of her life. And that was like my first play I ever had produced. And so I was very influenced by Colette and kind of idolized her. And I still kind of idolize her. And though her books I don't read quite as often as I did, there was definitely a period that was really influential, I'd say, in my teens, you know, like early teens, like maybe, you know, 13 or 14 to, you know, well, I don't know, 16 or 17 in particular. But then I've always read her all my life and come back to her. And I think it's her descriptions and her, you know, I loved the world she was in. I loved that she had this kind of wild life at a time where, you know, things were actually pretty wild, but when we're in our time, we can think, oh, back then things were more staid. Well, they were not more staid. And she was so cool, you know? And she was in that whole underground lesbian world of Paris, and she did trapeze in the attic with her lover, and she had Monsieur Billy, this kind of weird figure who would lock her in. And I mean, the whole life, she became like a celebrity. But she was such a serious, good writer, and had so many lives, and I just thought, I still think that's kind of a great, the way she embraced life, and the way she her sensuality and the way she was very, there was no morality, but she was incredibly keen, observer of human nature. And so I think she really influenced me a lot, both as a kind of a role model and also as a writer. And I think she's a really good writer who's a little bit forgotten now, and I'm not sure why. I don't find, people are talking about her short stories or her novels. Maybe they're seen as, I don't know what they're seen as. I have no idea what the conversation is, but I still, when I go back and reread, I think, my God, she's amazing. So I love Colette, and she was influential. Otherwise, I don't know. I just read so widely. So I think that in terms of influence, then I don't know. I always think about early books. I read a lot of classics when I was a kid. I read a lot of Greek mythology, and I was lucky to get kind of a classical education. So I read a lot of books. And nowadays, I'm rereading The English Patient, we were talking about before, and that's been really interesting to revisit. And I'm finding I probably first read it whenever it came out, like 15 years ago or something. And I liked it a lot. I love Ondaatje, and I liked it, but the movie was so bad. And I read it before I saw the movie, but still, I just didn't go back to it, and then I went back to it now specifically because somebody told me, this might be helpful structurally with what I'm working on my current book. And so I'm reading it for structure. I'm reading it, to see, what is that about? What can like I tell my students, what can I learn, what can I maybe steal from what he's doing so successfully to figure out maybe I could, solve something. And, but I'm also just totally sucked in. And I'm just bowled over by it. And I don't remember being bowled over 15 years ago. So that's really interesting, even though I've always liked his writing. So, now I'd say, wow, The English Patient. Oh my God, have you reread The English Patient? It's so good. So I don't know. It's kind of weird.